Welcome, curious minds. Today, we're really getting into Fareed Zakaria's book, The Post-American World, Release 2.0. It came out back in 2011.
Right, and it's a really influential piece of work. Still very relevant, I think.
Absolutely. So our mission today is really to pull out the key insights from this book. We want to look at how power dynamics were seen shifting, over a decade ago.
And what that shift means for us now, looking back.
Exactly. We'll touch on the rise of these new global players, how American power was changing, and the kind of challenges and opportunities that pop up in this more connected world.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating, I think, is the timing. It was written right after the 2008 financial crisis.
Right.
And Zakaria argues that crisis actually sped up the power shifts he was describing.
Yeah.
It kind of blew up that old idea, that if the West caught a cold, everyone else got pneumonia.
Yeah, that definitely didn't happen that time.
Not really. Emerging nations, China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, they showed, well, pretty remarkable resilience. Less of a crisis for them, and you could argue, a real acceleration of their influence.
Okay, so that's a great starting point. Let's unpack this whole idea of a post-American world. What did that term really mean back then, according to Zakaria?
Well, the core idea is what he called the rise of the rest.
The rise of the rest? Okay.
Yeah. He positions it as the third big power shift in modern history. For, well, most of the last century, the U.S. was just dominant. Economics, politics, science, culture.
Unrivaled, really, especially those last 20 years before the book came out.
Exactly. And this book was basically saying, okay, that specific era is changing. It's not that America is finished, but its relative dominance is waning because others are rising.
So it's not just like a few countries getting richer. It's a more fundamental shakeup.
Precisely. It's not just about economics, though that's huge. It's power becoming more diffuse, moving in all directions, up, down, sideways.
Which makes things more complicated for everyone.
Definitely. Makes traditional ways of using national power, less straightforward, less effective maybe. And the book points out these growth rates in many countries were just, well, unthinkable a few decades before.
So what drove this? What were the big forces pushing towards this more open, connected world?
He highlights three key things. First, the free movement of capital, which really took off.
Okay.
Then, mobile goods. That's been happening for centuries. Think 15th century ships starting global trade.
Right, the flow of stuff.
Yeah. And then more recently, since the 90s really, mobile labor, people moving more easily.
And this created these incredibly complex global systems.
Totally. He gives this great image, like a sporting goods store in Nebraska, sourcing from China, selling to Europe, maybe getting its accounts done in Bangalore, that kind of global web.
That really paints a picture. And how did this look on the ground? Were there specific countries that, really stood out as examples of this rise?
Oh, absolutely. He talks about places like Brazil and Turkey. If you looked at them maybe 20 years before the book.
You'd see typical developing nations, maybe slow growth, some instability.
Exactly. But by 2011, they were showing really strong growth. Pretty stable democracies, too. It was a visible shift, tangible proof of this rebalancing.
But this global growth wasn't all smooth sailing, right? He talks about problems of plenty.
Right. That's a key insight.
Yeah.
This huge global demand started creating new kinds of strains, like oil hitting almost $150 a barrel in 2008.
And that wasn't OPEC squeezing supply.
No, not primarily. It was just massive global demand, especially from the rising economies. Same with food. Commodity prices hit a 200-year high.
Wow. Leading to food inflation.
Yeah, and even conflicts over resources, like water in some parts of Africa, the Middle East. Prosperity bringing its own set of headaches.
Okay, so we have this complex world, economic growth, but also new pressures. You might think this demands more cooperation, but then there's another paradox the book raises, isn't there, about politics?
Yes, it's this contrast. The global economy is humming along, integrating, but politics often feels really messy and troubled.
Yeah, you turn on the news.
Exactly. But here's the twist. Zakaria argues our gut feeling that we live in crazily violent times is actually wrong, statistically speaking.
Really? That seems counterintuitive. War and organized violence have declined.
According to the data he presents, yes, significantly, which makes you think about perception versus reality.
So why do we feel like things are so violent? News cycles, terrorism focus.
Probably a mix of things. But his analysis of, say, the jihadist threat is interesting here. He argues al-Qaeda actually weakened itself considerably.
How so?
By alienating ordinary Muslims.
Yeah.
There are attacks in places like Indonesia, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. They killed many locals.
Creating a backlash within the Muslim world itself.
Precisely. Polls he cites showed declining support for violence against civilians in Muslim countries. And crucially, unlike, say, Soviet communism or fascism, he argues this fundamentalist model offered no real viable alternative to the Western idea of modernity. It wasn't a competing ideology in the same way.
Okay. So if we have these big global issues, terrorism, climate, pandemics, economic stability that need cooperation, but we have more players now, these risen nations, what does that do to our ability to actually agree on stuff?
Yeah, that's the rub. More players at the table often means it's harder to get consensus. It's a core challenge of this more multipolar world he describes.
To really get this rise of the rest, maybe we need to understand how long the rest wasn't rising, how long the West was dominant.
Exactly. That context is crucial. Western dominance intellectually, materially wasn't just a blip. It's been the reality for like half a millennium.
500 years. Wow.
Yeah, and the book gives some great historical illustrations of why.
Like the Zheng He example, the Chinese explorer.
Right, early 15th century. These absolutely massive Chinese fleets, huge ships, thousands of crews sailing around the Indian Ocean, way beyond anything Europe, designed to impress, to shock and awe.
But then it just stopped.
Pretty much. The emperor who sponsored them died, the policy changed, and eventually they literally destroyed the blueprints for the ships. It took China 300 years to send another ship all the way to Europe after Zheng, his last trip.
That's incredible. And the contrast is with European exploration.
Yeah. European missions were often smaller, maybe messier, but crucially, often entrepreneurial. Self-financing, driven by merchants or smaller states, not just one emperor.
So one stopped, but the other created this chain reaction.
Exactly. A chain reaction of exploration, science, and new technologies. The West, generally, embraced change and new techniques. While China, like the Qianlong emperor famously telling the British they had nothing China needed, sometimes it closed itself off.
And this had huge economic consequences, right? Like escaping the Malthusian trap.
Yes, that's a really important point. That trap where population grows faster than food, keeping everyone poor. The West, through innovation, new ways of organizing society and production, broke out of it.
While Asia, for longer, remained stuck.
Largely, yeah. The book compares 19th century labor productivity in England versus the Yangtze Delta in China. The difference was just enormous, driven by that Western innovation.
And it wasn't just technology, it was also about society, civil society.
Right. He argues that having strong independent groups, guilds, universities, businesses, separate from the state was really key in Europe and the U.S. It fostered dynamism.
Whereas in many other places, society was weaker relative to the state.
Often, yeah. Civil society was less independent, more reliant on government, which could stifle that bottom-up entrepreneurial energy. He even mentions how, in certain historical contexts, some traditional beliefs, like certain aspects of Hinduism, were seen as barriers to that kind of development.
Fascinating historical perspective. Okay, let's fast forward back to the rise of the rest and focus on the big ones. China and India.
The two giants, yeah.
China first. The workshop of the world, making what, 2/3 of the world's photocopiers and microwaves back then? The scale is just immense.
It really is. Think about Walmart, its revenues dwarfing tech giants like Microsoft at the time. And that whole low-cost model was built heavily on Chinese manufacturing.
But it's not just manufacturing, it's the political system too, right?
Yeah.
A non-democracy managing this incredible growth for decades.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the unique puzzle of China. The book notes it's probably not going to become a Western-style liberal democracy anytime soon.
Right.
But it is changing. It's not static. He mentions Chinese officials were actually studying places like Japan or Singapore or even Sweden, countries with long periods of single-party dominance, but still democratic in some ways.
Yeah.
Looking for models, perhaps.
Interesting. Pragmatic. And then there's the economic connection with the U.S., China holding huge amounts of U.S. debt.
Yeah, the oversaving issue, piling up U.S. Treasury bills, which, as the book puts it, basically acted like a massive stimulus program for the United States.
Keeping our interest rates low, funding consumption, a very tangled relationship.
Deeply tangled. Chimerica, as some called it.
Okay, now, India. Described more as a tale of the future. What's different there?
Well, one huge factor is demographics. As the West, and even China, gets older.
India stays young.
Yeah, relatively. It has this massive young, working-age population bulge coming through. A demographic dividend, they call it. Ironically, partly due to past family planning not working as intended.
And economically, poverty falling, private sector booming.
Definitely. Poverty rate halved in the 20 years before the book. A really dynamic private sector quite different from China's state-led approach in many ways.
And you can feel the energy, the book says. Indian companies buying Western ones, Bollywood's influence.
Yeah, there's this palpable sense of confidence. He calls it a noisy democracy that has finally empowered its people economically.
But there's a but, isn't there? A question about whether India can translate that energy into effective national action.
Right. That's the central paradox for India in the book. A strong society with a weak state. Governance is the big challenge.
People are dynamic, the economy's growing, but the government struggles to deliver.
Pretty much. Voters often turf out incumbents, hoping for better governance. It suggests a frustration, a gap between potential and execution at the state level.
And globally, how does India see the world? Different from the West.
The book suggests a shift away from the old narrow-era idealism towards something more pragmatic, maybe more internally focused.
And influenced by its own worldview.
Yeah, he mentions the Hindu worldview, its tendency towards tolerance, practicality, maybe being comfortable with ambiguity, less likely to see foreign policy as some grand crusade.
There's that striking detail, too, despite having 150 million Muslims.
Right. Not a single Indian Muslim found linked to al-Qaeda at the time the book was written.
Yeah.
It speaks volumes about India's internal dynamics and integration, however complex.
Okay, so we have this rise of the rest, China and India leading the charge in many ways. What does this all mean for the United States itself? Is it just decline? The book uses the British Empire analogy.
It does, noting Britain's peak economic dominance was actually quite short. But then, yeah, there's a really interesting point about the U.S.
Which is?
That America's share of global GDP, surprisingly, has stayed remarkably constant for over a century, hovering around 20–25%.
Really? Despite all the changes, that suggests some serious underlying strength.
Exactly. And the book dives into those, the economic and tech base, obviously, but especially higher education.
University.
Yeah. Holding something like, depending on the survey, over half, maybe even 3/4 of the world's top 50 universities. And crucially, being really good at turning ideas into actual products. Nanotech patents is one example he gives.
And it comes back to how people are taught, not just for tests.
That's a key argument. The American system, for all its flaws, tends to teach people how to think, to question, to challenge, not just memorize.
Which fuels that entrepreneurial spirit. Taking risks, being allowed to fail and try again.
Right. That culture of innovation and risk-taking is a huge asset. Plus, there's demographics again. Compared to Europe, Japan, even China facing aging issues.
The U.S. population is still projected to grow significantly.
Yeah, more workers, more consumers, more dynamism. That's a big structural advantage looking ahead.
Okay, so lots of strengths.
Okay.
But the book definitely doesn't ignore the challenges for the U.S., right? Especially internally.
Oh, absolutely not. It points to the economy being maybe too internally focused, despite global corporations doing well. And the big one, the political system.
Dysfunctional.
Gridlock.
Yeah. Increasingly polarized, unable to make big compromises or tackle major long-term problems. That's highlighted as a serious vulnerability.
So how does America navigate this new world? If it can't dominate, what should it do?
Well, the core message is, embrace the world you're in. Except you can't run everything. Make smart choices like focusing more on Asia. Cooperate more effectively.
And it still plays a vital role, even if it's different. He uses that parsley crisis example.
Yeah, that tiny island dispute between Morocco and Spain in 2002. Sounds minor, but the U.S. had to step in and mediate. It shows America is still often the indispensable nation for sorting out messes, big and small.
And America's power isn't just the government, right?
Yeah,
Foundations, universities.
Exactly. A lot of American influence works through non-governmental channels. The book suggests the government could learn from them, engage more ordinary Americans globally.
And realize that winning arguments globally isn't just PR.
Right. Earning international support, building legitimacy for your views, that is power in today's world. With so many competing voices and narratives, you can't just assume everyone sees things your way.
And the final point about fear.
Yeah, a really strong closing argument. Stop being so fearful. He argues post-9/11 fear led to strategic mistakes, damaged alliances, created paranoia.
And even hurts domestically, like potentially alienating America's own well-integrated Muslim population.
Exactly. If leaders start demonizing groups out of fear, it undermines a key American strength, its ability to integrate diverse populations relatively successfully.
Wow. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground there, really unpacked the core ideas from Zakaria's book. So for you, the listener, navigating this world, which has only gotten, well, probably more complex since 2011, What's the takeaway?
Yeah, we've seen this accelerated rise of global players, the changing role of the U.S., all seen through this decade-old lens, which is fascinating in itself.
It really is.
So maybe the question to ponder is this. In this kind of world, where you've got global growth bumping up against geopolitical messiness, and where old-school national power doesn't work quite the same way, what's the role for individuals, for groups beyond just nations? What responsibility do we have maybe in trying to shape things, foster cooperation?
That's a great question to leave people with. What role can you play in this shifting landscape?